Good morning, Hafiday Senators. The Committee of the Whole is now back on. We are still on Bill 248. We'll now recognize Senator Espaldon on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two amendments, and I will address the first one concerning the definition of general sales tax. That is what's missing. It's one of the components that's still missing in this bill, and so the amendment is on everybody's table. Basically, definition of the sales tax, and it will be a tax assessed on the purchaser of goods and services, and if you will, please put a comma after services, purchased on Guam or purchased outside of Guam for delivery to Guam, comma, that are subject to the levy of Section 26701 of this article, and the purchaser is not specifically exempted. And I think it's important definitely to make sure we understand this kind of sets what a general sales tax is and who will be the taxpayer that pays this tax, because that was also missing in this bill. So, and on top of it, again, you notice the language, even goods and services purchased outside of Guam for delivery to Guam. That basically sets the stage for us to look into taxing internet sales. And that's my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Espaldon. Any discussion on the Espaldon amendment? Are there any objections?
For just before you hammer it in, I hope there are no objections. But again, just to encourage, it's a technical correction, but after the word services on the first line, a comma needs to be placed.
Okay. Got it. Are there any discussions? Any objections? Motion passes. Still recognized, Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only other amendment I have now is basically, as I spoke to it last night, there is nowhere in this bill that requires that the general sales tax be a visible tax. And so basically it reads, for a business responsible for collecting the general sales tax established by Section 26701 of this article, at the point of sale, the general sales tax shall be illustrated as a receipt line item. That basically is to make sure that the customer knows that what the tax is and can see it visibly. That's my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. On Senator Espaldon's second amendment, are there any discussions? Any objections? No objections, motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to request, yesterday we had a couple of due-outs that DRT was supposed to give us on the tax receivables. We discussed that $189 million is owed to the government. The request was a breakdown of how much is in principal, how much is the penalty, and how much is interest. And then also the DRT director stated that some of the monies they are having difficulty collecting because of bankruptcies or some other reason, and we also asked for accountability on those numbers. So, Mr. Chair, if the director of DRT could provide this information to us within the next hour, that would certainly help. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We'll request for staff to reach out to the Director of Revenue Tax for that information to follow up. Senator, Vice Speaker, you have an amendment?
I do. Thank you. I wanted to revisit this reorganization authority that we've given, this bill purports to give to the governor. It, except for a very few exceptions, it pretty much will change the protections for employees. And as we've seen recently in the news, I think the threat of furlough of employees or layoffs and, have been used. If the administration had their way, people would have been furloughed according to their threats by now, not if the AG had not come in and said that that was not being done pursuant to the existing rules and regulations. So I think that we have personnel, the Department of Administration has personnel rules and regulations that have been in place for many years that take care, are integral part of our merit system, taking care of merit employees. And I'm afraid that allowing promulgation of an entirely new set of rules at this time, when we give them this blanket authority, is actually just going to take away protections for the employees and add to the chaos. And so I would ask that they be mandated to use the existing rules and regulations for layoffs and furloughs, and that if there are any changes to those, that those be sent down, and or they can be implemented by the AAA, or if he's in a hurry, he could do like what they did and send down a bill changing 90 days to 30 days. So the governor had recently asked us to change the authority to furlough from 90 to 30 days, and that bill is, I think, been sent to a committee pending a hearing. But I think that's a better way to handle furloughs and layoffs. It's a policy that the employees will for sure be able to see, be able to rely on, and that all of us will be able to rely on and to see. And so my amendment, Mr. Chair, is to remove layoff and furloughs from the list in Section 2209 under the reorganization authority, so that the layoffs and furloughs will not be subject to entirely new rules. And they will be, I'm adding a new section on the bottom that says furloughs and layoffs shall be conducted pursuant to existing personnel rules and regulations. And I would actually capitalize the personnel rules and regulations, because that's a document that exists at DOA or at different agencies, and so that they continue to proceed by those rules. And if they need to change those rules, that they can either do it by the AAA right now, that's how you can change any rules and regulations, or they can do it by sending it down here if they want it expedited. But I just think that in our haste to give all kinds of broad authority to the governor to downsize the government, I think we've taken away something that even the Organic Act mandates us to protect, and that's our merit system. And I think this is the fairer way to do that. So he can continue to reorganize, but when it comes to laying off and furloughing, he just has to abide by the rules, or else change the rules in a way that's very, very public, Mr. Chair. So that would be my amendment, and I ask my colleagues for their support.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. On the Vice Speaker's amendment, are there any discussions? Are there any objections to the Vice Speaker's amendments? If none, motion carries. Senator, Vice Speaker, you still have the floor. If not, Senator Lee, you're recognized. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, colleagues. I had an amendment circulated yesterday, but I just want to ensure that all my colleagues have a copy of it. It's a new section to be added to this bill, visible BPT. Does everybody have this? If not, if we could just take a 1-minute recess to ensure that all my colleagues have a copy of the amendment.
Okay, we're in recess. Senator Lee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to offer this amendment. I'd like to offer this amendment for my colleagues to consider and for us to discuss. The more that I've been thinking about this potential or this proposed increase in BPT, I've really been trying to think about how we can have the least amount of impact on both our consumers and our businesses. I think that we need to ensure that consumers will understand what portion of the price that they're paying is associated with the BPT. And we've heard from many stakeholders, many people who've come out to the public hearings about their concern with this. And even if we choose to increase BPT and have a sunset, at the end of that sunset period, we need to ensure that businesses will roll those prices back and that our consumers will be able to feel some of that relief. So I'd like to propose this amendment. We want to ensure that what some of the people in our community have told us, that potentially prices may not go down, and was something that they experienced in the last BPT increase, that prices did not roll back. We want to ensure that there's that fairness to our consumers out there. And this is also something that has been raised by the business community. They are open to this kind of amendment. And I think that, again, it gives our consumers this kind of historical reference on an item that, let's say you purchase a pen for $2, you tack on that additional BPT, but once the BPT comes back down after the sunset period, you know what the price of this pen should be. And we want to make sure that we have that historical reference available for our consumers. And I just wanted to also note that this is existing law. In our law, it's optional. This was a bill that was introduced, Bill number 63, that was introduced by Speaker Ben Pangilinan, Senators Sanford and Fernandez, and it was signed into law. It's now Public Law 27-41. So this is not a novel idea, but I'd like to offer it up to the body for their consideration in the form of this amendment. And so it would just read that any person engaging in, transacting, conducting, continuing, doing, or carrying a business on Guam who is required to pay additional taxes levied in this act shall allow each customer the amount of business privilege taxes that will be transmitted to the government of Guam as a result of the customer's transaction. B, a person engaging in, transacting, conducting, continuing, doing, or carrying a business on Guam shall annually notify Department of Revenue and Taxation of its election pursuant to subsection A of this section. The rules and regulations required to implement this section shall be the same as the rules promulgated by the Director of DRT in implementing Public Law 27-41 that I referenced earlier, except that any increase to the BPT must be visible on every transaction. And again, I'd like to do this to allow for the least amount of impact to both our consumers and our business community. And I ask my colleagues for their support. Sujos Masi.
Thank you, Senator. Senator San Augustine and Senator Ada.
Mr. Chairman, having the BBT be visible, I am in support of. My only concern is that if the businesses are ready to apply this and be able to make it visible, do we have a sunset? I mean, do we have a time period? Will the author yield to that question? Is there a date when we want to implement this? How soon?
Senator Lee, would you yield?
I do, Mr. Chair. So again, I just want to reiterate the portion of this amendment that the rules and regulations required to implement this section shall be the same as the rules promulgated by DRT in implementing Public Law 27-41.
Okay, so does that mean that if the bill passes, they have to start showing it. I'm just concerned if some of the businesses say that they have to figure out their POS so they can reflect that. That's the only thing I'm worried about, that they may not be able to, and if they come up with that excuse, we gotta make sure we give them a reasonable period that no matter what, it's gotta happen. So they gotta work on it like ASAP, but just, we have to have a period, like a grace period, get it together, because it's gonna be enforced.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the concerns raised by the previous speaker, and I think that there is a little bit of a challenge in implementation. I'd have to agree with that. But I think that what's even harder is seeing a tax go up and stay up even after we attempt to sunset it. As a small business owner, that's a challenge. Again, as a consumer, it's a challenge. So I think that that's where we need our experts at Department of Revenue and Taxation to step in and ensure that this is implemented.
Thank you. On the Lee amendment, we have Senator Ada and then the speaker. Senator Ada?
Actually, I have two questions, Mr. Chairman. On paragraph A, starting on the second line there where it says carrying on a business on Guam, who is required to pay additional taxes levied in this act, I shall show to each customer the amount of BPT that will be transmitted. And in though that phrase, who is required, this business who is required to pay additional taxes levied in this act, seems to imply that, you know, there's a group that's required and there's a group that's not required, and maybe I would propose that we just delete that phrase, who is required to pay additional taxes levied in this act, so such that then it just reads, a person engaging in transacting or whatever business in Guam shall show to each customer the amount of business privilege taxes. So that will be, that is a motion I would like to make, to strike that phrase, who is required to pay additional taxes levied in this act.
Okay, thank you, Senator. On the ADA amendment to the amendment,
Can we just clarify that one more time?
Senator, can you please repeat it again, please?
Sorry.
So with the amendment then, on the second line should read only carrying on a business in Guam, and then the third line will read, delete the words this act shall show to each customer. So with the amendment, it will read, a person engaging in transacting, conducting, continuing, doing, or carrying on a business in Guam shall show to each customer the amount of BPT.
Does everybody understand the ADA amendment to the amendment? Okay, so what the amendment is that the Senator Ada is striking out on the second line of sub-item A, who is required to pay additional taxes levied in this act. That is what is being stricken. Okay, on the ADA amendment to the amendment, Senator Lee.
I have no objection to the amendment, Mr. Chair. In fact, I thank the mover of this amendment to the amendment. I think this helps to strengthen this language, and I thank him for this suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any other discussion on the ADA amendment to the amendment? Speaker?
I'm not sure if it's going to be taken care of in his second amendment, but it seems A is, or at least with this amendment, is going to make it mandatory, but in B, there's an election. Electing to do what if it's mandated?
Any of the movers would like to yield to that?
Well, he's commenting on paragraph B.
Okay.
I was only commenting on paragraph A.
Yes, but paragraph B says that if you elect pursuant to subsection A.
Well,
And so what are you electing? You either have an election or you don't have an election. You don't have a choice.
Okay, so perhaps we
If there's
can,
no choice, then there shouldn't be an election in B, and it should just be a visible BPT, end of sentence.
okay, thank you, Speaker. So perhaps we'll address this, and if there's perhaps an amendment to strike B, then we'll entertain that. So on the ADA amendment to the amendment, are there any other discussions? If none, motion carries. Senator Ada, you still have the floor.
I'm done. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Speaker, recognize.
If you're mandated to show the BPT visibly in A, is there a need for an election in B?
Senator Lee?
Oh,
You-
just in response to
Yes.
the speaker's request, we can just delete that language in section B.
All right, so
Would that mean that the entire B is stricken?
Senator Lee, would you yield to that?
I'd like to just take a brief recess and consult with legal counsel.
Okay, we'll take a brief recess. the committee of the whole is back on. Senator Lee?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. In discussion with my colleagues and our legal team, it looks like there may be some implementation issues. And also we had a brief conversation with the director of the Department of Revenue and Taxation on the election language and also potential effects this might have to duty-free businesses here on Guam and others. So at this time, I'd like to just withdraw this amendment in the hopes that we can potentially move this forward as a standalone measure in the future. Sujus Masi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. On the withdrawal of Senator Lee's amendment, are there any objections? Senator Lee, you still have the floor. You still have the floor, Senator. Senator Sanag, or I think Speaker, did you have a Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, I ask that we go to recess for at least 5 minutes so we allow the legal to finish up an amendment for the sales tax.
Okay,
They're trying to finish it up.
we'll take a 5-minute recess. Committee of the Whole is now back on. Senator Ada, you're recognized on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, yesterday we had discussed and passed an amendment related to the effective date of the entire act. And yesterday, what we have passed was that the effective date shall be not later than 30 days after the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan that's submitted by Imagalahing Guahan. So the amendment that I would like to make is this new language, and the amendment has been put out, such that then the amendment reads, "This act shall be effective upon submission of a fiscal realignment plan by Imagalahing Guahan to the Speaker of the Legislatura for the fiscal year 2018 that reduces net appropriations for fiscal year 2018 by not less than $30 million as compared to Public Law 34-42. So the mere act of the governor submitting this fiscal realignment plan to the legislature will then shall be the trigger to make this entire act effective. However, within the act itself are two other effective dates, and those effective dates was for the increase in the BPT. It will begin on April 1. That remains. And will sunset on September 30th. And then the other effective date within the Act is the effective date of the general sales tax of October 1st, 2018. So those dates, those start and end dates remain unaffected. What my amendment does is basically that the mere submission of the fiscal realignment plan by the governor will be the trigger to make the entire act effective. So that, Mr. Speaker, is my, Mr. Chairman, is my amendment.
Thank you, Senator Ada. Senator Uggan, and then Senator Nelson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I certainly had different conversations with a number of our colleagues in the halls with regards to the interpretation of the previous provision or the section that the senator is trying to amend. And I understood it completely when in fact we were discussing it. And he's absolutely right. The act shall be effective not later than 30 days after the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan for fiscal year 2018, which reduces net appropriations for fiscal year 2018 by not less than $30 million as compared to Public Law 34-42. So the kicker, when we acted on this amendment that was proffered by the senator from Talafofo/Deridu, Mr. Chairman, was very clear. Until the governor enacts and implements a fiscal realignment plan that would result in a cost reduction in fiscal year 2018 by $30 million, then this act will not become effective. In other words, if the governor wants to look at realizing some revenues as a result of the 1% or 25% adjustment in the BPT, the business privilege tax, from 4% to 5%, then he's got to enact a fiscal realignment plan. Otherwise, this legislation will not be effective. And I understood that very clearly, Mr. Chairman, because 2 days ago, we had an amendment by the same sponsor of this primary amendment that tried to incorporate the governor's proposal into the discussion, the governor's fiscal realignment plan into the discussion, so that we can, after that was accepted by the body, if it was going to be accepted, we can go into the individual agencies, Department of Education, Guam Police Department, Guam Fire Department, and change those figures. But, Mr. Speaker, this body, the majority of the members in this body, chose not to accept that amendment. So what makes me think, and our people of Guam who are watching this, think that when a fiscal realignment plan is submitted to this legislative body, which has no weight other than the paper or the electronic transmission, because what this amendment proffers is that, Governor, submit a fiscal realignment plan to the legislature, and we will have to act on it. Mr. Chairman, a majority of members of this body did not even want to consider the governor's fiscal realignment plan 2 days ago. So what makes me think that in about a month, or in about 2 weeks, or in about a month and a half, that we're going to come back to this very same hall and say, Governor, your fiscal realignment plan of reduction of $30 million, which still impacts education, which may still impact public safety, Guam Police Department, which may still realize a reduction in the Guam Fire Department. What makes me think, and the people of Guam feel a sense of comfort, that this body is going to look at that plan, accept it, and pass it, when 2 days ago we had that opportunity? So, Mr. Chairman, the way the language reads now is so that our people understand. It's a kicker. And let me read it once again, because the original amendment reads, this act shall not be effective not later than 30 days after the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan for fiscal year 2018, which reduces net appropriations for fiscal year 2018 not less than $30 million as compared to Public Law 34-42. The present provision that was adopted yesterday, Mr. Chairman, is sufficient because it still leaves the cash management responsibility to the governor's office. It still leaves the governor's office to maintain that responsibility in terms of reducing specific agencies that I would anticipate would be consistent with the reorganization plan of cutting the red tape and streamlining our government, and realize a cost reduction of $30 million. Otherwise, we're back to square one, Mr. Chairman. And that's my personal read. We are back to square one because we're saying, people of Guam, we're going to increase the business privilege tax by 1%, from 4% to 5% for the next 5 months. And guess what, people of Guam, that's going to come out of your personal pockets, because you're going to have to pay for more for the goods and the services that our businesses are providing. But in exchange, we're going to put in a caveat that the governor has to submit a fiscal realignment plan that maybe, if we can muster up the strength in this body, that we may act on it. Otherwise, the governor will have carte blanche use of all those resources in managing the cash of this government, possibly without reducing significant costs in the operations of this government. So are we in a cash crunch or not? And if we are, let's give, the governor asked for a revenue enhancement. The revenue enhancement is in the amended version of Bill 248. But we need to commit to the people of Guam that there will be a reduction, at least at the very minimum, of $30 million for the balance of this fiscal year, Mr. Chairman. And that's what the original amendment that was accepted by this body imposes on the government of Guam. And I say government of Guam because it's inclusive of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. So in my opinion, let's not try to pull a fast one over our people. And I say, in my opinion, because
Point
this
of
would be a
personal
fast one.
privilege,
You
Mr.
can-
Chairman.
you can
Nobody
claim
is
personal
trying to
privilege.
pull a
Senator-
fast one.
There's a point of personal privilege. Senator, please continue. Senator Agan, go ahead.
Senator Ada, if the shoe fits, then wear it. Because I'm saying that you're giving the governor, by virtue of this amendment, an option to submit a plan. And then all of a sudden, the BPT tax is going to increase from 4% to 5% with no real commitment of budgetary reduction, cost reduction for this government, with the exception of the $1.7 million that was proffered by the senator to my left. That, Mr. Chairman, is a concern that I have, because the commitment was to look at revenue enhancement options, reorganization, and cost reduction. At the very least, we need to give our people what they've been asking this body to do, because all of these things that are taking place out there, we don't like it. And I'm speaking, we, shutting down of 2 fire stations, shutting down of the Agana precinct. Certainly, unless someone in this hallway differs with me, we don't like some of these measures that have been undertaken. So, Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment because it doesn't go far enough. And there's no assurance that, in fact, this body is going to muster up the strength collectively to entertain a $30 million fiscal realignment plan, because that's all it's going to be. It's going to be a plan submitted to the legislature. A plan submitted to the legislature, of which we had the option to entertain a similar provision 2 days ago, and then to go in and meticulously adjust the figures as it applies to education, so that education does not have to absorb the millions and millions of dollars that right now the superintendent of education has presented to his board and to this body in some token. So I oppose this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly hope that our colleagues will feel likewise. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Castro and then Senator Nelson.
Mr. Chair, can we just have a quick 2-minute recess? If that's
Mr.
okay.
Chair, can I just address
I
it real quick?
believe that I was after Senator again, so I hope that.
No, I saw him request, and then I will recognize you.
Okay.
Do you have an amendment, Senator, that
Well,
you want to prepare?
I think I just wanted to ask for a 2-minute recess, I think.
Okay, we'll take a brief recess.
you.
The committee of the whole is back on. Senator Castro?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of Senator Ada's amendment. I think it's another attempt by the senators to have us arrive at a measure that can be implemented immediately. And so with that statement, I do have a follow-up question. I just want to clarify.
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman, because that was my position. I'm advocating on behalf of our people, and my statements were clear, that if we're going to ask our
Mr.
people
Chairman, could
He
I
hasn't
to
said
pay
anything yet,
more,
Senator.
no, I'm stating
Senator.
a point of personal privilege,
Okay,
Mr. Chair,
but just be
because
in
he
line because
referenced
Senator,
my
hold on,
statements.
Senator.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator.
I will not stand for it.
Senator.
Because if our people are going to absorb
Senator,
a
I'm gonna
cost
ask you to
increase in this
please
community, then
put
we
order
need to
in
make
this
sure we
hall,
do our
Senator.
part.
Mr. Chairman, can
Thank
you
you, Mr.
restore
Chairman.
order to the floor, please?
Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. My point, and I'll restate it clearly, Mr. Chairman, is to rise in support of Senator Ada's amendment in appreciation of his good attempt to arrive at a measure for all of us that can be enacted today. If I'm not mistaken, last night we took a commitment. We made a firm commitment by adopting a $30 million budget cut. Now, we're not all in agreement as to what those cuts are and where they should be applied. But I do have a question for the previous speaker. And I don't think this is personal. I think we got to stop taking these things personal. I think we can address this in an amicable, diplomatic fashion without having to raise our voice. And so my question to the previous speaker is this. Are you willing to wait another 3 to 5 to 10 business days because the director of the Department of Revenue and Taxation stated publicly and on the record it may take 3 to 5 days for his team to go back and consult and promulgate, probably even come up with a fiscal realignment plan that incorporates a $30 million budget cut that's required by this body. And then we're gonna have to hear that. So the question again, is the previous speaker, willing to wait by not adopting this amendment, should it not go through a vote of 8, another 3 to 5 to 10 business days until we can implement this revenue generation measure? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. The senator is not obligated to respond. However, if he does yield, we'll go ahead and recognize him. If not, okay, thank you. Senator Nelson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for the proffer of the amendment, if he would yield.
What is the
Please
question?
state your question.
With this amendment, is this basically saying that that the legislature does not have that the legislature will not need to approve the fiscal realignment plan, and that the governor may just enact the fiscal realignment plan upon his own discernment?
Senator Ada, would you yield to the question?
Yes, I will. Well, first of all, there's not a requirement that we have to enact the fiscal realignment plan. I think the law says we may meet to enact the fiscal realignment, but it doesn't require it. And what this amendment basically recognizes is the fact that what we've been talking about in the past several weeks is to provide the governor with additional revenue to be able to backfill some of that $67 million projected shortfall. And so with the BPT increase of 1%, it was stated yesterday that that would generate approximately $29 million, rounded off to 30. The fiscal realignment, the amendment is asking for a fiscal realignment plan of no less than $30 million. And so he's going to have to basically find where those cuts are going to be made, because he's going to be short. He's going to come up way short if he doesn't find those cuts. Now, are we now questioning 8 years later that this governor is not going to be able to make some responsible decisions, that in finding where to reduce $30 million? I hope that's not the case. And so even with what we have here, we're still going to be short approximately $8 million. So, you know, I mean, the alternative is he can submit the fiscal realignment plan. We can sit here and haggle over it for the next, you know, couple of weeks. And in the meantime, the people that are, the ones that are caught in the middle is the community. Because the further we push off this revenue, you know, the basically the enactment or the effective date of this act, it just overcoming what we've been doing and delaying things is just going to be that much harder. So, you know, so to your question, does that mean that once he submits it, we're not going to act on it or look at it? Well, that's the way it reads, but certainly if once the legislature receives it and any member feels that this is absolutely unacceptable, what the governor has submitted, then certainly at that time we can call the legislature in and say, we gotta, you know, really go over this with a fine-tooth comb, because shutting down public safety facilities and education facilities is unacceptable if that's what the governor chooses in his fiscal realignment plan. It's a long answer, I'm sorry, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just wanted to clarify that this does not take away the checks and balances that the legislature, with the legislature's authority. It just entrusts the governor that he would do what is best for our island. But thank you to the sponsor of the amendment for yielding.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Senator San Nicolas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment seeks to amend my prior amendment that would require the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan. And it changes it to just require the submission of one. And I'm just a little unsettled by this amendment, Mr. Chairman, because we already have one that's submitted. The way this amendment is written is that upon the submission of a fiscal realignment plan by Magalahan Guahan for fiscal year 2018 to the Speaker, the tax increases won't be effective until one has been submitted. But, Mr. Chairman, one has already been submitted. One was submitted on February 26, 2018 to the Speaker, which means if we pass this amendment, there is already one, and the tax increases just go into effect. And this kind of underscores the statements from some of the retiring speakers about whether or not there is actually going to be a commitment to make these cuts. Because since this fiscal realignment plan has already been submitted and satisfies what the requirements are in this amendment, are we then going to actually implement this fiscal realignment plan? Not a single special session has been called, Mr. Chairman, to pass the fiscal realignment plan. Not a single special session has been called to realize any of these savings as a matter of law. And if they were, then we could have reduced appropriations elsewhere and not have these facilities closing, not have fire stations closing, police precincts closing. So, Mr. Chairman, if it really is the genuine intent of this body to entertain a fiscal realignment plan as submitted, I proffer that one already has been. And by virtue of the way this amendment is written, it would already satisfy this amendment. And so therefore, if it is thus the intent of this body to act on that fiscal realignment plan, then let's act on it because it's right here in front of us. That is why the word enactment is so important in this provision. Because one's already been submitted, and you can submit 10. But if none of them are enacted into law, then none of them are effective. Now, whether or not the savings need to be realized is factual, which is just so hard to discern at this point. But even if it is, if it isn't done so as a matter of public law, then you can still keep a $100,000 press release machine down at Adelup while we close a fire station. Because you'll choose to cut a fire station rather than make those kind of priority calls. And that is why it needs to be a matter of public law. That is why it needs to be enacted and not just submitted. And that is why, as part of this tax increase bill, we need to include that language in there so that we can make sure that the right priorities are funded if cuts are in fact necessary. And so that we can also make sure that if cuts are not necessary, then we balance out the proposition of taxation accordingly. So I respectfully join in the objections of this amendment. I believe that we need to keep the term enactment in there, and if we are going to just make the submission and enactment of a fiscal realignment plan the end result, we already have one. Let's get to work and let's put it into this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I object to this amendment. It to me would nullify the intent of the original language. It would, pretty much mean that the sales tax and the BPT go into effect immediately, that there's really nothing else that we are requiring the government or the governor to show or to do, because as a previous speaker said, he has already submitted a fiscal realignment plan. I can't see why that wouldn't meet the requirements of this amendment if the language is changed. That's all that's required. One be submitted and they're good to go, raising taxes, BPT, and then the sales tax on our people. And I thought that it was the intention of our body to require more. And I really am perplexed a little bit because many of our members have been very critical of the governor's choices of what would be cut. And we saw the fiscal realignment plan that he sent down, and it makes general fund cuts. And we know that there were some agencies that were not touched, but there were other agencies who were funded in a large part by the general fund who were disproportionately affected, I think. And it was very clear that they were going to cut DOE by 8% or something around there, and the other executive branch agencies 3%. We saw that whole thing, public health 5%, public safety 6%, and I thought that putting in the original language that we had put into the bill that's now being amended, that it's because we were trying to get them to change those priorities or change the effects of those types of cuts on the people, because we believe that there are other places in the government that could still be cut. And I absolutely believe that, Mr. Chair, and I think if there's one thing that this crisis gave us an opportunity for, it is for that accountability that the people of Guam deserve. And I think to let this amendment go and let him to just continue, it's pretty much to allow him to continue the way he's been going, and to that it lets go of that opportunity that we actually have before us to demand true accounting and to make the cuts where we can see, to make cuts in what we believe are luxurious or frivolous expenses versus those that we believe are critical. And we have had the opportunity, we're in a very unique situation to have had the opportunity to see exactly where he proposes to cut. And I thought this body did not agree with that, with those the disproportionate impact on DOE and health and safety. I feel like this is because of what we've seen in the past few weeks, it's just not making any sense to me that we would allow that to continue, that we would allow this type of authority when we know how it will be used, and it's very clear to us. There are many cuts that the governor can make, which he is doing, which does not require legislative enactment into law of anything. There were certain things in his fiscal realignment plan that did require, legislative action, and that would have been things like he wanted 100% transfer authority, and but I thought that by requiring him to have a fiscal realignment plan enacted, we would be able to really look at the other places in the government. This realignment right here, I mean, the one we've received, does not really force that looking closely at those things that we had asked him to look closely at, such as the T-zone leases for office space, whether those can be cut, right? And we pointed out several others, and the people of Guam, actually, they are the ones, and I'm sure all of my colleagues have received emails, texts, and messages that were, everyone on Guam is sending us their suggestions of things that could be cut, abuses that they see. We see it in the PDN. This is the same person. We're going to say, all you have to do is tell us, continue as you are going, and we are seeing that, the salary raises at a loop were prioritized over other expenses in the government, and I think the legislature should not wash its hands at this point when we have this experience already before us. It's this, I respect the separation of powers very much, but I think this is actually something that is within our powers. Just like when we, do the appropriations. I mean, if we can get at this point, require him to give us other places in the government that should be cut, I think that's what we should continue to require that he do, and that this amendment is going to just allow that. We're going to lose that opportunity. We are not going to be able to, because giving him a sales tax is a very big gift, in my opinion, and it's kind of like we are deciding that the people of Guam are going to give this administration this extra spending authority, but we're also not, ensuring that they're going to be protected in the cuts that are going to occur. So I just don't think it's the time for the legislature to wash its hands of that type of action, Mr. Chair. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment presented by Senator Uggan. Number one, we've been discussing this for weeks. You want to talk about the fiscal realignment plan? Fine. We had the opportunity. We didn't do anything. Let's not make excuses for anything. That's number one. Number two, I asked the question yesterday when they identified the first 37 million. If it includes DOE, I object to that. I was told it didn't include. Okay? So that means the governor's got to give a brand new fiscal realignment plan, identifying where he's going to cut the 30 million. I believe this amendment requires the governor to give us a new one. My colleagues, take a look at it. $67 million shortfall. 30 million is all we're passing. He's got to find the other 37 or 30, which this amendment asks for. If he doesn't find the 30, I honestly believe that none of us are willing to give him any additional 30. If we want to talk about the sales tax, we've been talking about it. Until next year, it'll make 60. Next year will be 115 to 120 million shortfall. We, the body, have the authority to appropriate. We do the budget. If we believe that there's no money and the government plan is not going to work, then I would ask the speaker to call us into session and let's go over the budget. And then let's take the steps then. But other than that, I support the amendment and I wish that we'd move on.
Thank you, Senator. Any others? Senator Esteves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the impassioned speech provided by my colleague from the village of Zotnya, and it really got me thinking, and I do appreciate it. But, Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I have to consider the entire timeline that this body has gone through. Over a month ago, shortly after the SCIS, this body met and we discussed moving forward with the impending crisis and the shortfall that we knew was coming. And a colleague of mine, in his wisdom, had put it before the body and asked and made the recommendation, which I agreed with. Should we go back into a budget process? Should we go with the scalpel and start looking where we can cut and make adjustments as a legislature? And we were met with the craziest of looks. Like we were insane. What were we thinking? It's the governor's responsibility. It's his responsibility to put out the FRP, even though by law it wasn't even required yet. But it was a let's wait. It's on them. They have to do it. And here we are today. We've made so much progress with this measure, a comprehensive measure. I don't think people expect it to come out of this body. That touches on many things that I think many of us agree on. Reorganization, revenue generation, and reduction. We've given now the governor the authority in these times, the ability to reorganize the governor. Yet, we're going to make it more difficult for him to adjust via fiscal realignment, maybe one, maybe two, on how this reorganization is to be funded. And we understand this is going to take time, Mr. Chairman. We understand that it is right that it comes before this body. But if we're going to give the ability to reorganize the government, we have to give them the ability to address and put forth the funding necessary under this reorganization to realize efficiency and reduction. This body has always, and up to now, always had the ability to address the budget. And we still have that ability. If this passes, we could submit amendments to 3442 despite the governor's fiscal realignment plan. We can do that 10 times, however many times this body sees fit, as long as we have a majority vote in this body. And we can go through at any time with the microscope, with the scalpel, and make those precision cuts. We had that opportunity. But here we are now. And all I'm thinking, kids are huffa? Kalang tidzahu, lo malagudzu, na do-over? Time's ticking, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the sentiments, and I agree. You know, this has been a difficult process. But I just want to remind my colleagues, we always have the opportunity to adjust the budget. Nothing has changed. This does not change that. This does not take away the power of the legislature to come back into session tomorrow to provide 10 bills on how we want to adjust the budget. Not even the entire budget, little bits and pieces that we think is beneficial, that where we can find cost reductions. That's our responsibility. But as it was determined before, a lot of that time has passed. And we wanted to push it on the governor, so here we are today. That was the initial intention of this body. Let the governor decide the FRP. Let him figure it out. Okay. We give him the tools, we trust, but we verify with the powers granted to us via the Organic Act, which is oversight. And so I support this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I ask my colleagues that we continue to move forward despite our reservations, our issues of trust, because we all need to move forward together, all three branches of government, to address these issues we're facing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. Senator?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move a motion to the previous question on this amendment.
Okay, there's a motion for previous question. We'll give the mover of the amendment an opportunity to close. Okay, Senator, would you, where there's a motion for previous question that I believe ends all debate, and then we just give an opportunity for the mover of the amendment to close. Isn't that? Okay, well, we'll go ahead and call the question. All those in favor of the ADA amendment, signify by raising your hand. There has been an objection. Motion carries. We are on Bill 248. Are
Mr.
there
Chairman?
any? Yes, Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Chairman, I motion to rise out of the committee of the whole with the recommendation to place Bill 248 on the third reading file and to immediately vote after engrossment.
Mr. Chairman, I was trying to be recognized. I was actually about to walk up to you and hand over. I have another amendment that I wanted to proffer for.
Okay, well, there is a motion, an undebatable motion on the floor now for a motion to rise. If there's an objection, we'll call for the vote.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
I know it's undebatable, but if you allow me, we still are awaiting a lot of information from the Committee of the Whole that I brought up earlier this morning. So I think that we need to receive this information before we address the motion.
Okay, I believe you asked for a response in writing yesterday from the director, and so I'm going to ask him to provide his response in writing to you and to all members of the body.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so there is a motion to rise that has been, there's an objection to it. We'll now call for the vote on the motion to rise. All those in favor of the motion to rise, the Committee of the Whole, with a recommendation to place Bill 248 on the third reading and to immediately vote on it after engrossment. Is that correct, Senator? That's your motion? Okay, all those in favor of the motion signify by raising your hands. Motion carries. So we'll take a brief recess as we rise from the Committee of the Whole.
The special session is back in order. Mr. Majority Leader, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to report back to the body that Bill 248-34 LS was deliberated and amended in the Committee of the Whole with a recommendation to place on the third reading file and to vote upon engrossment.
Thank you for that report. I've spoken to the clerks, and it'll take it till probably 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon before they're able to engross. We're having to deal, as I understand it, there's been a number of amendments, and they're going to have to try to do this over the next day. So 2 o'clock on Friday.